The Cactus Store is a shop in Los Angeles that specializes in rare and bizarre varieties of cactus. And it's run by sort of a group of designers and artists and the legendary nurseryman John Morera. And yeah, it's sort of, we all have this common interest in uncommon plants. And shortly after we opened, we got this sort of cryptic message in our plant request book at the store from Herman Cummings. And about a week later, we were all working together. And shortly after that, we sort of received this request by this publication, The Thing Quarterly, up in San Francisco, and they wanted to do something with us. And around that time, Christian was pretty far up the old rabbit hole of Copiapoa. And so we thought it was sort of timely to condense or consolidate all of this research, the myth and the fact and sort of everything in between, into something. And so sort of along with doing that, you know, compiling all the research and the images, a sort of wider door opened, and that was to this sort of strange world of obsessives that locate and photograph rare and incredibly hard to find cactus. So sort of from when we did the lecture last October till now, we have compiled around 3,000 images of these plants all around the world, and we are putting them into a book that should come out in the fall called Zero File, and Christian will be doing the introduction, and we also will be doing an accompanying lecture with that. So we hope to see you all there. So without further ado, Herman Cummings, Copiapoa Cactus Under the Influence of Fog.
Copiapoa is a type of cactus that come from the Atacama Desert in Chile. If you're familiar with the region, plants found between Chaparral and El Cobre are the focus of this presentation. It's also one of the most coveted genus of cacti amongst serious collectors because it grows in one of the most difficult habitats on Earth. Likewise, Copiapoa has overcome near impossible odds to survive. Because of this, to have a mature specimen of Copiapoa on your windowsill can be a powerful existential talisman, but also because of its beauty. As it matures, Copiapoa will deploy an array of strategies which it has adapted over millennia to survive. One of these is called glaucum. Glaucum is the thick white waxy layer that grows on the stem of the plant. The purpose of glaucum is to protect it from the sun. It does this by reflecting the sun, keeping the moisture in and the sun out. Also notice the black coloration at the base of this plant. This is called desiccation. Copiapoa will literally allow itself to die at the base in order to stay alive at the top. In this image of Copiapoa hazletoniana, although just a plant in some anonymous collector's backyard, they felt a need to protect the image with a watermark. A sense of the numinous looms when dealing with Copiapoa, almost as if it were a shrine to some higher ideal. Also notice the scarring around the base of this plant. This is called a Rudolph ring, after the German botanist Rudolf Schulz. If a plant has a Rudolph ring, it means that it grew in habitat. This plant you're looking at here is very old. Other desirable characteristics include clumping. Clumping occurs when a plant is very old. Copiapoa grown in captivity usually don't get old enough to start clumping. They mostly show a solitary growth habit. And also woolliness. You can see that cotton substance on the top of this plant. The flowers will actually grow inside of this wool. Its purpose is to prevent their delicate petals from cooking in the sun. Such features have made Copiapoa popular among Japanese collectors because it appeals to the Japanese aesthetic sensibility, wabi-sabi, an idea that is difficult to express in words but is exemplified by this botanical anti-hero. These next images are growth records of various Copiapoa species kept by a Japanese botanist over the course of 20 years. In 1993, 300 botanists were chosen from around the world, given seeds from the Atacama, in the attempt, spearheaded by Rudolf Schulz, to study their growth patterns. As you can see here, these plants on the far left are the plants when they first start to grow, and then the plants on the far right are 20 years later. You can see they grow exceptionally slow. They grow 100 times slower in habitat. There's a feeling of connoisseurship that one feels when growing a thing that matures so slowly. Because these plants grow at an almost geological pace, there's a self-obliterating quality that also makes Copiapoa an ego killer. While 26 species have been officially recognized by the Chilean government, most contemporary scholars only accept 12 as distinct. For those who still reference Britain and Rose as orthodoxy, Copiapoa only comprises 6 taxa, while one especially prolific taxonomist claims to have discovered and named more than 2,500 discrete species. Admittedly, for many of the names he gave, he provided neither physical example nor location data for us to refer back to. Adding to our confusion, a single species might look very different if it's grown at higher altitudes, or in more or less light, or in richer or less rich soil. Diverse growing conditions make it very difficult for us to identify a species based on its physical characteristics alone. Though continued research has brought many of these varieties back into synonymy, there's still a lot to be done with regard to research, and few with the knowledge, resources, or ability to do it. Because of this, Copiapoa resides in a fog of conjecture, a fog that is in literal fact its habitat and also its main source of nourishment. The Atacama Desert is a land of absolutes. It is Earth's smallest desert, its oldest desert, and also its most arid. Parts of the Atacama are so dry they haven't seen rain for more than 200 million years, regions climatologists refer to as absolute desert. Relative to these dead zones, however, the habitat of Copiapoa, although 10 times drier than our own Death Valley, is a veritable oasis of barely surviving life, all thanks to a dense coastal fog called La Camanchaca. Camanchaca is a weather phenomenon specific to Chile's northern coast. It forms when freezing Antarctic waters from the Humboldt Current interface with Chile's desert coast. In other words, when one of Earth's most productive marine ecosystems collides with Earth's most barren desert beach. From this collision of opposites, a dense cloud bank forms daily to feed a parched population of cacti, lichen, and algae with a negligible supply of embalming fluid. This, combined with an inch or two of yearly rain for propagating seeds, Copiapoa has been able to thrive in the most punishing environment. However, in 1571, the rain did not come. Neither did it rain the following year. In fact, for 399 years, between 1571 and 1970, absolutely no rain fell on the region. Moreover, since 1970, yearly rainfall has been barely measurable, just between 1 and 3 millimeters. Surviving a 445-year drought is remarkable, but for Copiapoa, the price of survival has been sort of high. Today, there are no juvenile populations of Copiapoa in habitat, and it is believed the last seed to successfully germinate in habitat occurred before the drought began in 1571. That means the youngest plant currently living in habitat is an astounding 445 years old, and that every plant you see here is the last of its kind. Testing the efficacy of fog collection, in 1967, a cypress tree was planted in the foggy desert area of Norte Grande near Antofagasta, Chile. At first, a fog trap was used to provide the young tree with water until eventually it grew large enough to harvest its own moisture, enough to support its undergrowth, and remarkably, enough to contribute to the local groundwater supply. Today, Chile and Peru are living laboratories at the forefront of research into ambient water collection techniques. The same methods are currently being studied here in California by the Bay Area Water Supply and Conservation Agency in California. Zooming out for a moment, fog often plays a role in the cultivation of unique and remarkable plants, among which Copiapoa is no exception. Receiving local honorable mention are the giant sequoia trees here in California. Fog is also essential to the survival of a plant called Welwitschia mirabilis, a two-leaved Angolan monotype that's sometimes called the living fossil because its life can span thousands of years. Welwitschia also has the reputation of being one of Earth's ugliest plants. Famously, when Welwisch discovered the plant, he could not stop looking at it for fear that it might fall back into his imagination, from which he believed it originated. Usually a plant this old and this ugly is considered threatened and vulnerable to poachers. However, perversely, landmines left from a 30-year civil war in Angola have made these also some of the most well-protected plants on Earth. Another famous example of fog adaptation is the giant ash tree living in Australia's coastal forests. This notwithstanding, the last Copiapoa to successfully germinate in habitat occurred 35 years before Willem Janszoon discovered Australia itself. Walking among these little plants, you feel as though you are walking among ancients in a time before the Age of Enlightenment. But if we wish to be keen observers, we must resist the urge to scapegoat reality, science, facts, or even botany when discussing Copiapoa. This is because Copiapoa is a being outside of time, a survivor out of context, and a thing beyond the purview of possibility. Its habitat is a psychogeography of disregard for the binary perils of life and its ultimate consequence. Copiapoa's gaping lifespan is a psychogeology unconcerned with germination and termination dates and rates. Copiapoas are more like stones, just one of many of Earth's pre-extant fixtures. They were here before we thought to notice them, and though effectively alive while extinct, they will no doubt outsurvive us. What sense have we concerning ourselves with their survival? These plants will no doubt continue to existing even if they do not continue to survive. And they'll continue to evolve, but in their own way, not by adapting, but by remaining exactly the same, by becoming even more entrenched while the world around them changes. Even if the Earth itself were to become totally incoherent, Copiapoa would probably continue with steady indifference to occupy space-bound fragments of Earth shrapnel, floating aimlessly through the void because Copiapoa is a pataphysical organism which conforms to pataphysical laws by breaking them. Themes resonant with a romantic temperament abound when we discuss Copiapoa, not just due to their obvious relationship with picturesque meteorological phenomena occurring in barren landscapes, such as seen here in Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above Sea Fog, or in The Sea of Ice, which depicts upheaval in Antarctic waters. But a similar romantic feeling is echoed by the plant itself. Copiapoa is a solitary botanical ruin living on a wasteland beach, its habitat engulfed in a drone of dragon's breath fog. and with the psychic gravity of a funeral dirge. In Caspar David Friedrich's Monk by the Sea, we see a totem-like figure in Pandey Azúcar. Where have all the Copiapoas gone? I'm reminded of the solitary stem of Copiapoa columna alba, columna meaning column in Latin, and alba in reference to a medieval form of poetry, usually about lovers who part at dawn. A similar melancholy is echoed by the work of German Romantic painter Karl Spiesweg. In this image, we see a monk perched on monastery balcony overlooking an empty mise-en-scene. He's accompanied by various South American cactus specimens that in 1860 were simply unavailable to the average German windowsill. In this Goya-esque image by Spiesweg, we see a lone Zarathustra half-crazed and playing his viol, while a magnificent blue agave marks the path to his cave dwelling. In The Cactus Friend, we see a reclusive old bachelor demonstrating the extent of his social life, while in a similar painting, The Cactus Enthusiast, we see an old hoarder surrounded by stacks of newspapers, bowing to a mammillaria as if he were the ambassador of humanity. The cactus returns with a gesture in kind. I digress only to point out that cacti, and by extension Copiapoa, aren't native to the modern human mentality, one the Romantics lamented. Rather, they represent a miscarriage of the modern. These motionless microliths navigate through blinding fog like some eyeless dirt-eating rat or an albino cave-dwelling newt, relying not on their perception of the outside world, but on extrasensory apperception, not on accurate maps of external terrains, but on their reflective cognizance of internal states. What do I mean by this? If you look at this image, at the center of Copiapoa, there's nothing, just simple substance, a mass of irreducible stuff. Within the inner sanctum, a holy stupor of flesh without parts. It is by virtue of its inner meat that Copiapoa registers for us as something and not nothing. This is where Copiapoa reveals to us its existential twist, that there is an end to things that last forever. The plant demonstrates to us how to be corporeal without having to wait for something, that everything could be different and it would still be okay, that it is possible to thrive without striving, and how we too can participate in this beautiful travesty. Copiapoa is a living paradox, a sun worshiper who cannot tolerate the sun. It is at once the most adapted cactus and also the most delicate of plants. Allowing its lower stem to die, Copiapoa will deprive one extremity to provide another with moisture, offending life in order to preserve it. Copiapoa is the quintessential fog dweller. If, for some reason, the fog lifted, even for one day, heat from the sun would desiccate its stems beyond all recognition, because fog is its lifeblood. Except, of course, for Copiapoa solaris, an outlier species found above the fog line. Looking at geological studies, and by studying their roots, we now know these mounds to be more than 1,000 years old, some of them even large enough to view from space. Yet there's no reason that modern science can yet conceive for their survival. Now, if this was some other plant living in some other terrain, such a factoid might boggle the mind, but for Copiapoa, this is just one in a series of unlikelihoods that endears us to its plight. Will we unlock the secrets of this botanical lemming before it hits the rocks? As artists, we resonate with the tenor and meaning of Copiapoa's message that there are better ways to reproduce than biologically. As this barely understood and grotesque little cactus has inspired many a cactus friend to contemplate life's most devastating poetic fact, that impermanence is permanent. I opened with a quote, so now I'm going to close with one. This is from the British Cactus and Succulent Society's Genus of the Month discussion board, written by a hobbyist and prolific discussion board contributor who goes by the handle Killer Spines Mahuta. Constant as it undergoes observation, Kamanchaka unfurls with dependent devotion to the incalculable. Universal placeholder, passive destination, absolute region of patience, remote and frozen equilibrium, disengaged from being achieved, a road to nowhere, which is an actual road to a factual nowhere. So imaginary that it has become more real than the imagination who broadcasted it. So bitchin'. That's it, thank you. So, I guess if there's any questions, we can take those now. Wait. What was that? Let's do that. No, let's do it. More than one question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, that was wonderful. So 2 questions, I guess. It grows up to 145 years, that's amazing, and even longer, but I was wondering, when did it first start blooming, and if there's been any research into what, like its pollinators or anything like that at all?
If you're interested in the subject, there's an incredible book that really is a labor of love by, we've mentioned him in the lecture, Rudolf Schulz, called Copiapoa and Their Environment. It's really the only comprehensive study done on the plant, and even recently, until recently, people haven't really looked at too much at plants under microscopes, really. But they used to name plants based on their morphology. So if the flower of this plant looks like the flower of this plant, they would put it in the same category. Copiapoa, there's just no money to study a plant that's in the middle of nowhere that grows slower than stones. So, but this book, it's really good, and yeah, there's been studies done on the pollinators and all that kind of thing. But for instance, one example is glaucum. They don't know what it is. They don't know how it's produced. That's the white stuff on the plant. There are some theories, but nobody has been able to replicate that outside of habitat. And nobody really knows why.
And one of its pollinators is like a big-ass fly.
It's a fly. Yeah, they're fly pollinated, yeah.
Is poaching a problem?
Poaching is both a problem and a solution. It's tough because you're in a part of the world where there's no rain. So if they build a road to do copper mining, for instance, and it kicks up dust, that dust will get on the plant and it will never rain off, and the plant will die very slowly. It'll just suffocate. So there's this new type of conservation, which is kind of weird because it sounds like the sort of right-wing version of conservation, which is, they call it ex situ conservation, which really means privately owning plants, and taking them from habitat and not calling it poaching. But it's a problem and it isn't a problem. These plants, their habitat is a death row. They're not surviving, they're dying. And a lot of these images of the dead plants, you notice they look like ashes because it's so dry. The bugs that typically, and the mycology and the ecosystem that usually breaks down organisms doesn't exist over there. So it'll take years for them. They'll be sort of dead. They're just sort of turn to dust. It's very strange.
Are the flies anything special because of such a harsh habitat, and like have they adapted to coexist with the cacti?
You see in that video, it's like a National Geographic video. All the creatures that live off of the fog. All of the life in that part of the desert lives off of the fog. It keeps everything is sort of going. And outside of the fog, there are some bacteria that live inside of rocks, but other than that, it's virtually lifeless. And when you get further inland where the fog doesn't happen. Yeah, so the flies are the same. The flies, the alpaca will eat Copiapoa humilis, but it's kind of remarkable. Those creatures are sucking water out of the air plants. But yeah, the insect life's the same. We have some plants. These plants here, they're from our personal collection, my personal collection, Cactus Store's personal collection. I think there's 2 on this table that are for sale, but be careful with these. These are very, very, very old. These are older than Shakespeare plants over here, and then one Welwitschia. But there's plants inside of this, inside of there that are also mature plants and of all different species of Copiapoa. Check it out. It's worth checking out. And if you have any other questions, I'm around, and these guys are around. Thank you. Yeah.